Good afternoon from Chicago, Illinois, and welcome to Tourist Railroad Connections, episode 13. My name is Michael Kuehl, and I'm the president of Dynamic Ticket Solutions. I'm joined by my co-host, Josh Miller, station manager for the North Shore Scenic Railroad. It appears that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Some restrictions appear to be relaxing, but things are moving fast and furious. More than ever, we need meaningful connections. None of us have the right answers on how to navigate these uncharted waters. None of us has ever dreamed of what we now face. We are all working in the dark, using our gut instincts to make decisions and trying keeping our organizations afloat. Today, Josh and I, along with our panelists, will be furthering the conversation we started over a year ago. We don't have all the answer. We're not claiming to be experts. We are facilitating a dialogue to share ideas and help establish or reestablish connections. We'd like to encourage you to participate in our discussion. On your screen, you should have a dialog box entitled Go to Webinar Control Panel. And within that box should be two sections. If you look at the bottom section, you should notice a gray bar labeled questions, and just below that, another white box with the words type questions here. Simply type your questions and either hit return or send, and we'll do our best to work your questions or comments into our conversation. I do have a little bit of exciting news, at least I think so. We've launched a companion website for our webinar. You can point your browser to www.railroadconnections.com. There you will find links to past webinars, register for upcoming webinars, and something brand new. Corinne Williams, a member of the DTS team, came up with an awesome idea. She created and moderates a private group on the Facebook dedicated just for Tourist Railroad Connection. She would like to invite all of you to join our group by simply visiting the new website, clicking on the Ways to Connect link at the top, and on that page there'll be a link that'll lead you to join the group. So, Josh, episode 13.
Yes, indeed, episode 13, lucky 13 here. I actually got married on Friday the 13th, so I can't say much about superstition here. So. Thanks for having me back, Mike. I am super excited about that Facebook group because it's a really quick and easy way to communicate, and the people who are allowed into the group are the people who are same on this webinar. This is not a webinar for the general public. There's not thousands of people on it. This is specifically for the managers of tourist railroads. So we span from sea to shining sea of different types of railroads. We're tiny little nonprofits that have 2 train cars and a locomotive, and we haul 50 people on a weekend, all the way spanning to huge, large operations that run steam trains and thousands of people each weekend, or 7 days a week all summer long, or year-round for that matter. So that is the people who are on this webinar watching today, and you as the viewer get an opportunity to ask some questions of our panelists here that we have representing the governing bodies of sorts for the tourist railroads industry. So I'm super excited about that. The people we have here with us today is Rob Castiglione from the Federal Railroad Administration, the FRA. We all know about them. Douglas Deskin from the Transportation Security Administration, more commonly referred to as the TSA. And of course, Mark Ray from the HeritageRail Alliance, the epicenter of knowledge here for and communication for the tourist railroad industry and railroad museums alike. So I'm really excited to talk to you guys today. I will get back to you in just a second, but as Mark mentioned before, be sure to use that question and chat box. And what defaults to the right side of your screen, there's a chat box. You can comment or like things. You can also ask questions in the question box, submit those through. Mike will kind of moderate some of those, and we'll get those through to our panelists. So we want this to be an interactive conversation today. A little less than an hour, and I hope you will enjoy us here at your desk or something while you're working, and we'll get some good information for everybody as it directly relates to you, the people who run the tourist railroad industry. So we'll get started here. I just want to give a quick little welcome and maybe just a super brief 30-second tell me about yourself kind of a thing to our guests. Rob, I'm going to start with you. You're down in Texas there, and you work for the FRA and have for quite some time. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yep. Actually, I started my career with Southern Pacific down in San Antonio. I'm a Texan native, but I've moved around FRA quite a bit in the last 34 years. I finally landed in the position that I think I was born for. I'm responsible for not only the training role, but voluntary programs. You may have heard of SOFA, FAMES, C3RS, and a new one that's coming out that's still in research phase. So I'm not sure I should mention it, but I will. It's called RISE. It's modeled after the aviation system of sharing information. So delighted to be here and can't wait to answer questions that may be on people's mind.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us. And Doug, I'm going to turn it over to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
My name's Doug Deskin. I'm a surface inspector with the Transportation Security Administration. I joined TSA when we first stood up back in 2002. I started in the screening program. I moved over to regulatory in 2005. I've been doing surface ever since. I'm based out of Denver, Colorado, and I have a coverage area right now, the state of Colorado and the state of Wyoming right now. And with only 2 of us in our office, it makes for a very hectic time, but we get a lot of road miles in. And we're basically responsible as the TSA for the security side of the house, for rail and mass transit and public transportation, all modes of transportation, actually. And it's been a fun experience so far since 2005.
Gotcha. Well, I'm sure you have some stories to tell us, but you bring a great deal of experience here, both between Doug and Rob, that I'm looking forward to having you. We all know Mark Ray, but tell us a little bit of introduction of yourself there, our president.
30 seconds. Let's see how quickly I can do this. Well, obviously, I've been president of Heritage Rail Alliance since the merger back in 2012 between ARM and Train. We started out as the Association of Tourist Railroads and Railway Museums, and that was such a mouthful. And we actually used a rebranding process to come up with the Heritage Rail Alliance. And I'm a strong believer in the strategic planning process, and we use that to help us get through the merger, and it's kind of driven our path forward ever since. And, you know, we do a lot of stuff from putting on seminars, conferences and symposiums. Like recently, we just had our virtual symposium that was very successful, and we shared a lot of great information. Rob was actually part of that in the FRA presentation that we did. Then we have our recommended practices out there. We're about to launch our quarterly publication again, which is something that's been sorely missed. We do a lot of stuff in DC on Capitol Hill and advocacy and helping people learn how to do fundraise at the local level. And we really don't get a lot into the nuts and bolts like RPCA does, but we try to help establish ways for groups to communicate with each other and network with each other. So we as an industry can move forward together and get better and stronger and attract more visitors and bring more tourism dollars into what we do. Because, you know, it's while a lot of this has been a hobby to us, it's actually about growing the communities and being a part of the community and help people visit our locations, learn about history, learn about the social aspects that railroads had on their local communities, and then also improve coordination between these agencies here, the FRA and the TSA. You know, I really appreciate their involvement, willing to work with us so that we have to be safe. You know, safety is our #1 priority. You know, it's the first rule in the rule book is safety. And so we appreciate Doug and Rob both being a part of this today.
Yeah, fantastic, and that is the truth of it all. I mean, what we're talking about today is regulations and things, and specifically how they relate to COVID and you know, masks and things like that, which we're going to get into in just a couple of minutes here. But you know, in the end of the day, the FRA and the TSA are here to apply regulations which promote safety and for the greater good. And meanwhile, organizations like the Heritage Rail Alliance and Dynamic Ticket Solutions, for that matter, provide tools to grow our businesses, which is fantastic. So those are the two kind of main things that sometimes kind of go hand in hand as we try to continue to move forward in the world. They sometimes collide, and that is kind of the current state of the industry for the past year when we have restrictions on capacities and things. So we're going to get into that quickly. On myself, Josh Miller, Duluth, Minnesota, North Shore Scenic Railroad is where I'm at. And the North Shore Scenic Railroad operates train excursions, about 100,000 people a year up the North Shore of Lake Superior. Come out and visit us sometime. We'll move into our conversation here, though, and I'd like to talk a little bit about, before we get into the COVID stuff, let's talk a little bit about regulations and where does the various organizations fit in. Rob, tell us just kind of a brief overview of how does me as a little tourist railroad operation, where does the FRA fit into me as they relate to, say, the BNSF or a big company like that?
First brain fart of the day. Actually, it's unfortunate, but it's a one-size-fits-all approach. There are some considerations for small entities that we published back in 1988 for exercise and jurisdiction, but for the most part, if you're a general system operation or if you get on the general system for tourist and excursion, we touch you. It could vary from railroad to railroad. There's a waiver process involved for seeking relief from certain regulations, and I've been involved with waivers on the Strasburg Railroad, as a matter of fact, and I've been involved with others. But I know that from being around so long, I worked as an equipment inspector for many years, that the regulations that apply to BNSF, like for example freight car inspection, if you're a tourist and excursion and occasionally operate run freight cars, those same regulations apply to you that apply to BNSF. There's some things that can be waived again, like in hours of service. There's the accepted track piece, but for the most part, it's with the regulations that affect class ones. If you're a general system operation, they hit you too.
Sure. Well, that's good to know. All right, and so the fairly newer entity here in the room is the TSA. And Doug, tell us a little bit about where does the TSA fit in when most of us are familiar with the TSA as they relate to airlines, but they span all the way into transportation and rail, and including tourist railroads?
Correct. TSA got responsible after the ATSA Act back in 2001, after 9/11. We're responsible for all modes of transportation on the security side of the house. Okay, and we cover, with our inspectors, we have basically three modes. We have aviation, cargo, and surface. Now, the aviation and cargo folks, they deal with the airports, the airlines, and everything else that are out there. Myself and my partner here in Denver, and of course around the country, we cover everything else, which means class 1 railroads on certain things, tourist railroads, public transit. We do pipeline, we do trucking, we do busing, we do every other mode that's out there besides what has wings. And when it gets down to tourist railroads, we cover both those that operate on the general railroad system and those that don't. So like we do narrow gauge, for example, like the Durango-Silverton here in Colorado, okay, Georgetown Loop, any of the narrow gauge. We do funicular, inclined plane, monorail systems, cog railroads like in Manitou Springs, everything like that, we cover it. What's a little bit nicer for us than it is for like my counterparts that like with Rob and at the FRA, we only have 2 regs for tourist railroads that we cover, okay? And they're basically, I hate quoting chapter verse, but I will. 49 CFR 1570-201 and 1570-203. The only 2 regs that we have. One is for a primary and alternate security coordinator, and the other one is for reportable security events. And there's like 8 of those, and it's listed in the reg, and they're required to contact our transportation operations center, let them know what's going on. And it's usually when something really bad has hit the fan. But those are the only 2 regs. There's a couple of other regs that give the definitions and applicability and stuff like that, but the majority of just those 2 regs.
So you would look at the TSA's involvement with tourist railroad less as a, say, governing body such as the FRA, and slightly more regulatory suggester or service provider?
Well, basically for the surface side of it, since we are so new, we really haven't had a chance. On the freight rail side, we have a little bit more advanced regulations that are out there. For tourist railroads right now, it's basically an informational source that we're here. We want to know if something has happened to a tourist railroad. Lord forbid you get that one passenger who comes on that's going to be a real nutcase, you know, the type I'm talking about. Every now and then we get one, any type of security event. But we want to make sure that everything is safe and secure on those railroads. And if we have something come down from headquarters, like we did with the security directive, we had to be able to get it out to everybody. So we needed a primary and alternate contact points with contact information to get information out of headquarters down to the various tourist railroads.
Interesting. And so you have that communication ability, which is kind of an interesting.
Which is great, yes. We need to be able to get a hold of everybody, yeah.
Right, excellent. Mark, anything to quickly add to just what they were talking about as they relate? You know, Mark's directly involved here with the Tennessee Valley.
Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum, yeah.
Yeah, Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum.
Well, I'd like to just tie on to something that Doug said. Something that's in our recommended practices is an emergency plan. And recently, you know, there's been a lot of active shooter events that have become very prominent throughout the country. And you know, we encourage that a lot of railroads go through emergency exercises. And, you know, what would you do if you had a security event? Because they can happen. And this is the kind of stuff that Doug would need to know about. If you have a security event, you know, one of the things that ought to be in your plan is contact the TSA, because they need to know about these things. And that's where that communication piece comes in, that, you know, as you go through your emergency planning, be sure to include notifying the TSA that, yeah, we had this happen and here are the details, and, you know, get that information to them.
That helps to illustrate a little bit better. I think I don't know if everybody, you know, watching today, and that's what we're trying to do here, is kind of better understand where does the FRA fit in with the TSA and as they relate to us. And that I think I have a much better understanding there. Let's kind of transition into COVID world. COVID-19 obviously affected us all through the past year. Lots of different regulations coming from lots of different directions, many of them that railroad operations didn't even know they necessarily had to follow. You know, there's the old adage of the railroad not necessarily having to follow local ordinances and things, but yet we live in these communities and we have to follow certain rules here and there. And so we've got state and local cities and you know, the TSA and the FRA and just the government in general issuing new ordinances that managers like me had to suddenly discover that guess we have to know about that now. And we all kind of experienced a lot of learning over the past year, right? Let's talk about the recent surprise, let's call it, last Thursday night that we all got. When the CDC issues the repeal of mask requirements from their perspective, of the need for vaccinated individuals to have to go out masked. Up until this point, masks are required indoors for pretty much everything. And, you know, at least in the past 13 episodes and the representatives of the different railroads that we've had on, everybody took COVID fairly seriously, very seriously, actually, in the railroad world. Mostly because many of us feared shutdowns and things like that, or as many railroads have actually. Not every railroad museum made it through this. Let's start with where we're at, like a status point of, you know, I think it went from, you know, CDC issues this here in local Minnesota, the governor spoke right afterwards, and then he repeals the stuff, and all the different governors have kind of had their ability, and then it's down to the individual businesses or those local cities to figure it out. But yet, railroads still have the governing bodies of the FRA and then the services of the TSA. Rob, I'm going to start with you and kind of a status update since last Thursday.
Okay.
Mask mandates and rules and things like that.
Yeah, well, I'm not an expert on EO32, but I did get the latest recite from the guy that's kind of leading the charge at FRA for the mask mandate. It's at 2:47 p.m. local Central Time here, and the textbook response is this, because I wanted to, you know, provide the update on what is the latest. It reads, FRA understands that the recent released CDC interim guidance for fully vaccinated people may create the perception of relaxed requirements regarding the mask mandate. However, the CDC order has not been modified, and FRA's emergency order has not been changed. FRA and the Department of Transportation are actively engaged in discussions regarding CDC guidance and expect to have additional information soon. So status quo.
Interesting. And I mean, for those who don't know, and you may have cited it here, there's an FRA mandate for train crews specifically, that there's potential personal fines and things for not wearing masks in a locomotive cab if you're with another person and so on. Is that correct?
6 figures. Yeah, it's a lot of money. So that's correct. It's EO 32. Just Google it. It'll come right up if you're interested in reading the full text. Emergency order 32. Echo Oscar 32.
And I guess one thing that is, and let's call it a really great thing, that the FRA is very specific, both in the the U.S. RNG Corps as it kind of translates into rules. There's not a lot of gray area when it comes to most declarations from the FRA.
Well, for emergency orders, you're right. I would beg to differ on some of our regulations, but in EO 32, it's pretty clear, at least the way I read it. Again, I'm not a subject matter expert on EO 32, and I won't try to interpret it for you now. I just know that it's pretty serious business.
Let me ask you, EO 32 is focused though on crews and employees. Is that correct, or does that fall into passengers as well?
Passengers as well. Yeah.
Basically, any human being who walks onto a train or whatever.
That's correct. Yeah.
All right. With no known information as to when that is forthcoming, or new information is coming.
Coming soon. That's all I can tell you. We expect something coming soon. In fact, when I emailed him after our conversation this morning, he said he was actively involved with conversations as we spoke. So I thought we would have some late breaking guidance come out, but no, it's the same as it was before the CDC news release last week. So nothing's changed.
All right, good information. Now, meanwhile, Doug, let's turn to you. The TSA also issued we'll call it a proclamation, but I think it was just a couple months ago, really putting the iron fist stamp on the mask mandate. Tell us a little bit maybe more about that, and then also where the TSA fits in as it would complement the FRA's regulations.
Well, ours was, if you look it up, will be SD 1582-84-21-01. A lot of numbers there. It came out on the 2nd of February, and it affected all public transportation. And that not only affected tourist railroads, okay, but it also affected Amtrak, Greyhound, all mass transit operations, bus or light rail, heavy rail, however you want to look at it. If it was public transportation of any type, you had to wear a mask. And it was cognizant on the owner operator to gain compliance by that by means possible. An example I'll use is a bus operator. If you have a passenger, most of our bus operators these days have a box of masks on the bus. So a passenger gets on without a mask and they'll offer him a mask. If he says, I don't want to wear it, then it's incumbent upon the operator to stop at the next stop and tell that passenger to get off the bus. And if that doesn't happen and the PD is called, or an SO or whatever, and then you still get your compliance by they getting off the bus, and by then I get involved and I'll get a phone call from the operator, goes through our operations center, then I have to do my part on it. And basically that's in a nutshell, but it's been that way since February the 2nd. It's been extended now until September 11th, until, like Rob was saying, we get that magical phone call from our headquarters and says that it's not in effect anymore. And I'm the same with Rob. I haven't heard anything from my headquarters, but I was expecting to today, but I haven't. And I have a feeling sometime within this week, hopefully, or maybe next week, we'll get some word if they're going to let this SD expire or if they're going to continue with it. But as of right now, it is in effect for everybody for public transportation.
So that's a double layer of mandate, really, that both complement each other, if you will. And just to be super clear, this includes tourist railroads equal to an airplane or Amtrak or a bus or anything like that, despite the fact that a train is more of what we offer is more of a ride out and back, not transporting you anywhere.
Yeah, it's basically because tourist railroads, there is a applicability. It's in 1582.1. It's covered on Section 4. Each tourist, scenic, historic, or excursion rail owner operator. Okay, so everybody is covered on it. And there's been questions, and I've been getting them for the last 2 to 3 weeks, especially on the topic of open gondola cars. I hate to say it, but yeah, you have to wear a mask right now and social distancing in an open gondola car. Okay, until such time as the mask requirement is lifted.
Sure. Mike, I'm going to turn to you real quick because I have a question I think that kind of relates to right where Doug left off here.
Right. So Rachel Shipley from the Walkersville Southerns asks us, are both masks and distancing required or just masks? And you might have just
At
answered
this time, at best time, both.
both.
And Rob, that would be the same for the mandate that the FRA has. Yeah. Interesting. So maybe I could steer just a little bit towards as it relates to food and things, if you can help explain maybe how both of these mandates relate to dinner service. The scenic railroads have had a struggle over the past year or so to really identify where they fit into the world, both in city regulations and things that don't necessarily will consider us in their writing of mandates and things, as they are also scrambling to, kind of move with the times here. Because scenic railroads also fit into both, it's equal to a bus in terms of a coach seat, and you're in a seat within in an enclosed compartment. However, we're also this open air car, as you mentioned, these gondolas or whatever, that you're outside are you an outside park or at that point, or what are you doing? And then there's also the enclosed food area, which is essentially equal to a restaurant, right? So maybe you could, just kind of help to explain a little bit how these regulations fit specifically into food service as they may be on the road. Kind of take a volunteer as to who wants to go first on that one. If maybe Rob, want to touch on that.
I'll take it, Rob, if you want me to.
Go ahead,
Rob,
and I'll comment.
Okay, section D of RSD hit it right on the head. It says the requirement to wear a mask does not apply under the following circumstances. And it says D2, while eating, drinking, or taking oral medications for brief periods. Okay, prolonged periods of mask removal are not permitted for eating or drinking. The mask must be worn between bites and sips. Now that's, I know, kind of hard, but that is how it was written. I know Mark's laughing. I know, I agree too, bites and sips, but that's how they wrote it. Okay, and I've always maintained common sense on if you're eating, okay, eat. If you're going to take a break, put the mask back on. But yeah, between bites and sips.
That same way, same language in the emergency order, bites and sips.
Right, and I think Amtrak has an announcement thing on their thing that says, you can't be drinking a cup of coffee for 6 hours or something like that.
Right.
Another question from the audience there, Mike. Tom Hutchinson from the New Hope Valley Railroad states, I checked the Amtrak website yesterday and they're going to full capacity on May 23rd. So no social distancing there, just masks.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that is kind of an interesting thought here, is that I think social distancing is becoming a slightly more gray area word, right? As it pertains to capacities and capacity limitations. I'm not entirely sure that Amtrak was ever specifically required to reduce their capacity by the FRA or TSA, were they?
To my knowledge, they were not.
It's more of a precautionary thing, and I believe the airlines did the same with, like Delta. I think they weren't selling the middle seat for a while, but I think that was self-applied restriction. Tough to say for sure, I guess, I don't want to put anybody on the spot here. But it's a worthy question that Tom is bringing up here. That if they can go to full capacity, it certainly removes the need for social distancing. For anybody who hasn't traveled via Amtrak, coach seating works exactly like coach seating. You might have to sit next to a stranger, and that's a huge piece of that puzzle to navigate these waters of COVID restrictions. Mark, any thoughts on, just where, kind of the difference between Amtrak in terms of need? Oh, look, Mark, are you on?
Yeah, I was going to go back to the social distancing part there for a moment, because think back to last year when we were all being shut down and HeritageRail came out with the guidance. We looked at what the health departments were coming out, and we came up with those recommended guidelines, and social distancing or physical barriers were amongst those. And you have to remember, that was one of the initial measures we put into play to help us try to move towards reopening. And it was all, voluntary, but it was kind of driven by what the local health departments or the state health departments were putting out. And I think even the CDC had some initial guidance on, hey, we think at this point that social distancing, keeping everyone far enough apart, will help reduce the spread. But now when you look at the vaccination numbers and the way that the cases have declined, everything, the numbers are showing us getting better. And we even talked about back then last year that we thought this would be a gradual reduction in restrictions as we slowly reopen back up. And so I think that's what we're actually seeing now. We're finally experiencing that, okay, so the social distancing barriers are starting to come down. And hopefully we're going to see some reductions in the mask requirements once, I presume much like the way that the security directive and executive order came out, it came from the White House, through an executive order, that once that new guidance comes out, then that'll cascade its way down through the system. And as the CDC further refines their guidance, we'll see more changes and further relaxation of restrictions so that, by later on in the summer, as, we reach higher numbers in terms of vaccination rates, we'll be back to, life as normal again, I hope. So, it's a far cry from where we were last year when we were trying to figure out how we were going to survive. And now we're looking at, okay, we're anxious to reopen. We know people want to do things. People want to get out and ride trains, experience life again. But, we still got to keep the brakes on for a little bit and wait for the rules to actually really get relaxed. We all know it's coming, but I encourage everyone to keep in check. And, as soon as we get word from either Rob, Doug, or I'm sure as soon as Doug gets relaxation in the security directive, he'll reach out to all his contact people and let the word know. And we get immediate updates from the FRA. And as soon as we get those, we'll be sharing that with our FRA, our HeritageRail membership. So I just kind of wanted to go back to that previous point, Josh, and reiterate a little bit more.
Sure.
And what was your question? I think you had something for me.
No, it's okay. I actually want to kind of steer that from that question a little bit about, government agencies and how fast they can move. Because we all know that government agencies in general can be very.
I thought they moved really quick getting the directive out there. It was within like 2 days after the executive order came out from the White House. I think that was January 29th when Biden issued it or something like that. And then bang, in 2 days. Yeah.
Wow.
So that's an interesting question there. I mean, from what I understand, that the White House executive order piece is actually still the kind of looming question mark. It hasn't been officially retracted yet, even though, I think Biden came out and gave a little speech after the CDC changed their rules and stuff, but officially the White House hasn't changed its perspective, and all of that has a trickle-down effect in order to repeal this. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Right now, when they do finally decide to do it from the president's office or anybody up there, it'll go directly to DHS, through the secretary, and then through TSA, get to our surface division, and then there'll be a blast email out to every surface office. You have to realize I'm here in Denver, but we have surface offices in most of your major cities here, and it goes out as a blast email, and everybody will contact everybody as fast as possible. And it goes rather quickly. It did on February 2nd, I'll tell you that much.
That's interesting. And Rob, tell us a little bit about how moments you've seen in history anyway, like over time, of the FRA moving fairly quickly on something like this that might be, all right, we're going to retract it or change the guidelines or added guidelines.
Well, emergency orders is the way we do it. So I was here when the runaway trains were sliding down Cajon Pass, and they issued emergency order. I think it was 21 at the time, for requiring two-way into-train devices on trains. That came about fairly quickly. So regulations take time, right? So when you're issuing regulations, you have to go through public comment, and then that takes time, and then there's all sorts of vetting that has to happen at different various agencies within government. So emergency orders is what FRA typically does when they need to move quickly, and that was appropriate in this case, and so be it. I'm just speculating here, but I suspect that we'll see something, before the end of May on this to harmonize with the CDC recent release. Again, I mean, caution, I'm just speculating, but I would expect that we see something before the end of the month.
Sure. Well, that tells it, because I mean, a lot of what we have done in this series over time has been kind of a crystal ball thing. It's no one can predict the future, but we as managers of businesses we have to be doing projections and thinking about what is the next step, or how is this looking, and things like that. In one of our recent episodes, we talked about a very optimistic summer ahead. Businesses, specifically in the tourism industry, every webinar, seminar, thing I've been to are all projecting way ahead of where they should be in terms of budget, in terms of actual sales and reservations and things like that. So,
Sure.
So we have to speculate a little bit. Mike, I'm going to turn to you for questions from the audience.
Okay, Travis Stevenson asked when he registered, if my entire crew is fully vaccinated, do they need to wear masks in the cab or when volunteering on shop projects?
It's a great question. What is a shop, right? Is it inside, is it outside? Big, huge doors, pole barns, things like that. Any volunteers on that one?
Be you, Rob.
I say, again, I'm not an expert on EO 32, but the way I read it, master required. So what can I tell you? I mean, I can provide at the end of this webinar, I can provide you the point of contact for getting clarification. We were supposed to get some FAQs out the door a couple of weeks ago. I've not seen them yet published. Maybe would have addressed that very question, but I know what I'm going to do if I'm in that position. I think I'm going to mask up and be safe rather than sorry. Not so much for the pandemic, because I'm vaccinated, right? And I'm an old guy, but I'm vaccinated, so I really don't have any concerns. But if I'm a railroad worker and I don't want to risk being approached by an FRA inspector and being fined, I think I'm gonna mask up.
Indeed. So there you touched on something that, I don't want to get too political in it, but in the mask debate over time, has really been, some pushback from crews or whatever, but think of all the rules that we follow, black and white. We're going to follow, hours of service, for example. You're not going to deviate that whether it's a minute over the clock. Most of our crews all of our crews take, drugs and alcohol rules very, very, very seriously. And the even thought of deviating that for most is almost impossible to think about. And then, masks kind of work into the same thing. It's just there's a rule right now, so you follow that. Maybe it's going to change. You can hope if it does or not, but we've always kind of taken the perspective. It's kind of a black and white issue. It is or is not. It's yes or no. And if it's written as yes, then you follow the yes and go from there. Everybody who is listening, you are watching Tourist Railroad Connections, episode 13. We are here with Rob from the FRA and Doug from the TSA, Mark Ray from the HeritageRail Alliance. And we're having a great conversation here today, specifically as the FRA and TSA fit into the tourist railroad world, and more specifically how that fits into COVID regulations in a super fast changing world. I do want to encourage everybody here in our last 15 minutes or so to actively participate, jump in there and ask a question that maybe we haven't not yet touched on, because this is your opportunity, a golden chance to kind of ask a question that as it may relate to other scenic railroads as well. Mike, you had another question from the audience here?
Yeah, Corinne Williams from the Cumberson-Toltec Scenic Railroad asked, what levels of enforcement is the TSA expecting? Expecting during the excursion?
That's a great question. Before I get to you, Doug, I just want to mention that nowhere along the way in any state or federal or even local guidelines that I know of did anybody issue any kind of expectation or additional assistance to teach our 16-year-olds at the counter selling candy bars to now be the policemen of masks. Maybe touch a little bit upon what is expected of our businesses to relate to our employees in terms of enforcement.
Well, if you look at the SD that we've got out there right now, there is a section called Actions Required. And Section A is under owner-operators. And it says they must notify passengers with prominent and adequate notice of the mask requirements to facilitate awareness and compliance. At a minimum, this notice must inform passengers at the time tickets are purchased or when otherwise booking transportation, and at the time the conveyance departs its location after boarding passengers of the following. Basically, the federal law requires wearing a mask while on the conveyance, and failure to comply may result in denial of boarding or removal. 1, 2, refusing to wear a mask is a violation of federal law, and passengers may be subject to penalties under federal law. Owners and operators must require that the individuals wear a mask for any persons in a public transportation, passenger railroad, or bus conveyance covered by the SD that I just mentioned. Any person in public areas of transportation hubs facilities controlled by the owner-operator, such as for purposes of purchasing tickets, waiting areas, platforms for boarding and disembarking, for the duration of travel, boarding and disembarking. That usually means when you have your stations, okay? I'll use Union Station down here in Denver for an example, okay? Or you can do it for tourist railroads if they're standing on the platform waiting to get on the train, okay? And owner-operators must ensure that direct employees and contractor employees wear a mask at all times when in conveyances or in or around transportation facilities under their control. And there's a couple of exemptions on there as well, but it's awful long. I don't want to read the entire SD verbatim. But if you need a copy of it, I'll be glad to send it to anybody who requests it.
No, that really put it into perspective a little bit about the expectations of where the points of interaction are with customers that is expected to happen. It's not a staff member walking around with a billy club, enforcing the rules and standing over someone to make sure that they keep their mask on at all times. It is active participation at the points of boarding on the station and both at the boarding area, and then of course throughout the trip, but not necessarily every single minute you're standing with an individual rider.
So I just want to jump in just for a second. I did send the contact information for EO32 as well as a link to EO32. I'm just going to let folks read it themselves and draw their own interpretation. As I said before, I'm not an expert on EO32, nor do I want to be. Okay. So pass along the information and let you folks decide what it means. And it's the lawyers and the guy that's in charge of actual filling all the questions at FRA are both included in that text that I sent. So I can speak about training rule and I can speak about close calls and FAMES and SOFA, but I would be doing a disservice if I wanted to try to break down EO32 for you. I know the basics of it, but I don't want to get into the weeds on it because it's not in my wheelhouse.
Sure, that's totally great. And Mike, you can probably help to facilitate sharing that.
Yeah, we'll include that in the email that goes out after the webinar. We'll make sure all of that's included. Sure. And I also have a follow-up question from Lawrence Perlman from the East Troy. He's asking, can we go back to social distancing? Does that mean just while boarding or while seated as well? In other words, can we load to capacity?
Well, Mike, Josh, I'll be honest, and as I'm reading my SD again for like the fourth or fifth time, I will say this: there is nothing within our SD that mentions social distancing whatsoever. Okay, it is basically stating you must wear a mask. Okay, so I will honestly say that there's nothing on the TSA side that requires social distancing within this SD.
Well, for FRA, it does mention social distancing twice in the emergency order, and I think both are in the footnotes. And it reads that, here I'm trying to interpret, that if social distancing is not possible, then the mask require, that the carrier shall require masks. So I think, Doug, I think you're right. I think for both our agencies, it's not a mandate, but it's sort of, at least on the FRA side, indicates that if you can't maintain social distancing, that the mask will in fact be required.
Sure. So certainly some interpretation,
Yeah, definitely.
I'll say without making you say it, that social distancing itself has always seemed to be this kind of a little bit of a gray area.
Let me walk that back. It's if social distancing can't be maintained, it's in addition to the masking up. So I didn't want to indicate or imply that it was either or.
Sure.
So
I mean, it's my understanding of on all levels here that there is no real capacity limitations being enforced at this point, and probably not going forward. It's all kind of on our own. Just to share our own experience here in Duluth, we were selling our entire summer and fall as 50% capacity, because that's where we were at the time when we decided to put everything up for sale, even knowing that it was likely by the time we got to October, that might change. But we put up our entire summer schedule of 7 days a week as 50%. And we now have no regulation whatsoever on capacity that we know of here. And we still just decided to increase by 75%. So we're at 75% cap of what our normal 100-person train would be. So, it's up to each business how to do that. But I kind of looked at it as it's harder to go back. And we'll slowly increment that up and go from there. One thing that we talked about with Mark Ray in a previous meeting was, we created 2 budgets in over the winter budgeting time. We created a budget for 50% capacity and 100%. The 50% one's not good. It's not pretty, but it worked once we had to make certain adjustments. And we now know that we can kind of work within that 50% to 100% capacity range as it relates to restrictions and health and safety and things like that. We have about 10 minutes left here. We're coming up towards the end of our
10 minutes already. Jeez.
Yeah. We're keeping it to an hour.
I do have one follow-up for you. For the gentlemen or the folks who asked about eating food on tourist railroads, I did mention while eating, drinking, or taking oral medications for brief periods. There was a footnote on there, and I looked at the footnote, and it says the CDC has stated that brief periods of close contact without a mask should not exceed 15 minutes. So that's the quote for time. Okay, that's their footnote for brief periods. It's 15 minutes.
Interesting. Well, that's a super helpful range of, and that's a nice specific actually, is what is the time there that is kind of the tolerated, is it an entire dinner ride, or is it just a couple minutes here and there? From what I gather, that's about one course or so at a time, and then mask up for a little while and so on, at least as it relates to right now. Trains definitely exist in a much different world than being able to space out seats and things like in a restaurant. It's an enclosed dining car. And I'd love to know actually if Amtrak is doing dining yet or not. I know for a while they were still very limited options, and you were in sleeping cars, they'd bring you your food and stuff like that. So I'm not entirely sure where Amtrak is as far as that goes. Raise your hand if you know, but maybe somebody on our stream will. Mike, do you turn to you for another question from the audience?
Yeah, Bruce Hodges from the Cooperstown and Charlotte Valley asked this, and I'm not 100% sure if we've answered this or not, so I'd like to put it out there. And his question is, do volunteers out on the field track doing work need to be wearing masks?
Well, for sake of the conversation, because we kind of used the volunteers in the shop, but this I think is more maintenance away outside, in which case, you're on speeder car, let's say, or the pump car, traditional. But you're outside, but you're working, and you fall under FRA regulation. Would that be correct?
That would be correct. I know for many of our regulations, all of our regulations for that matter, that include volunteers, they are subject to FRA regulations, or I should say the employer is, but also the employee as well. They could be subject to FRA fines, personal liability. So the answer is yes.
Sure. Do we want to touch a little bit on enforcement from the government level? FRA tends to make visits once in a while and check on things and make sure that things are up to par and standards. I think we have a guy here in town right now checking on our steam engine. Tell us a little bit about maybe how visits go, and how they may pop up, how the FRA looks at visits and enforcement, and then also where that comes into the COVID restrictions as well, and enforcing is the EO2.
Well, for FRA,
Go ahead,
we
Rob.
typically go where the data tells us to go. We use compliance history is one factor. Complaints, accident history is another. Density, moves, cycles, whatever, whether it be train starts, crew base. I used to inspect steam engines for FRA. As a matter of fact, I typically tried to make every annual inspection that I could within my area, Texas, and all the states that touch it. That was just my preference to be involved with the annual or any hydro. I'd try to make all of those, but we typically follow the data these days. I've been around long enough to know back in the day we had a territory and we just made visits at different places. Now, we're data driven and we try to do things that tell us to go where it tells us to go, where we get the biggest bang for the buck in terms of compliance.
Excellent. No, thank you. I think that helps to understand a little bit. Doug, do you want to touch on that or anything?
Ours is a little bit different than the FRA's on site because the burden of ours reporting goes on to the owner operator. Actually, basically, it is their responsibility. If an individual refuses to comply with a mask requirement, it is the owner operator's. If it raises to the level of a significant security concern, and we leave that quite broad, okay, basically for the owner operator. If it's got one where it's normally, if you have the PD, the SO involved, or it could be a trespassing call or anything like that as well, okay, yeah, then they need to report it to our Security Operations Center and headquarters in Washington, D.C., and the phone numbers are included in the SD. What happens after that, basically I'll get notified by TSOC, and I have to come out and I'll do my investigation on it, and we do it on the civil side. And usually most times, first time offender, it also depends on the severity. But usually the first time offender, it's a warning notice from the TSA. Basically, they'll get a letter in the mail saying you were a bad passenger, you did something you weren't supposed to do, and don't do it again. Okay. And if you have that 1 in a million passenger who does it twice, okay, yeah, we can assess civil fines as well. And it's something we really don't want to do, but it is there, and we will do it if we have to.
Sure. Well, that helps to better understand on many levels, both from the FRA and TSA level, and a huge thanks to the great explanations that you guys have helped us with here throughout our past 45 minutes or so. It really better understanding, where both organizations fit in. Mark, I'm going to turn to you with HeritageRail Alliance, Tennessee Valley. Kind of changing the subject a little bit to, what do you foresee in the crystal ball ahead for the summer? You talk to an awful lot more scenic railroads and organizations than any of us do. What is the general feelings for the summer ahead?
Well, as we mentioned in our warm-up earlier, TVRM just finished 3 weekends of Dale with Thomas. And obviously, we're still dealing with some of the COVID restrictions, but very successful event. And those of you that have got Thomas event scheduled for later this year, as the requirements further get relaxed and you can increase capacity, those that are doing August, September dates may be able to actually return to full capacity. And there is pent-up demand. And I mentioned this in our recent virtual seminar, or symposium that the data that I get from PGAV associates and their Tuesday newsletters where they look at what's going on out in the industry shows definitely there's people that are just dying to do things. And since they couldn't go anywhere last year, they're sitting a lot of capital and a lot of money to spend. And this is probably one reason why we're seeing a little inflationary pressure right now, is everyone knows there's a lot of dollars out there to be spent and everybody wants to grab some of them. So what that does to the economy, I don't know, but as long as we can get the pipeline back in service, those of us here in the South can go places. I know that was a big challenge for a lot of people that were coming to our Thomas event. Is there gas this weekend? Because sure enough, here in Chattanooga, we had stations go dry. And so, and you know, I can sit here and look at Doug, TSA, cybersecurity, you know, does that fall under you? It's a pipeline. You know, and in my real job, I work in the electric industry, and you bet we have cybersecurity requirements that we have to fight, but I don't want to go down that path. But going back to the original question, Josh, I do think before the summer is over, we're going to see a return to normalcy. This winter, we should be able to do great polar / whatever name your winter train is. And then hopefully there'll be enough people. We're going to do a / virtual live event this fall for Heritage Rail. We decided to put a virtual component with it because we know a lot of people still won't be able to travel just from financial reasons. And so we're working to put that program together. Part of it's going to be at the Philmont Scout Ranch, a youth engagement camp. And so if everyone built those double budgets, they're probably going to land somewhere in between, Josh, depending upon when they can get reopened and how well they can get their events. I think a lot of people probably want to think about doing some more large format events later this year, any kind of special that you can do to get more people in the gate, because I think they'll want to come.
And certainly time to do some makeup work as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of people did keep their maintenance programs going. I read a lot about restoration projects that did not stop at all. You know, they had a little shutdown till they could get readjusted, but a lot of restoration projects kept going all winter long, and a lot of track maintenance got done. So I think a lot of people really took time to get their houses in order the best they could, because a lot of this stuff was driven by donations or capital funding, which didn't get turned off. So they were able to keep moving forward. The Paycheck Protection Programs helped a lot of us.
Sure.
And I know at least Bob LaPrelle at the oh, good Lord, don't shoot me, Bob. Museum of the American Railroad in Frisco, Texas, he applied for the Shuttered Venues grant. And I don't know if he's been successful yet. I haven't heard, but he's at least one operator that did apply. Now, they don't do trains, but they had what he thought qualified for fixed seating.
Sure.
But as far as, and actually, I think that was one of the questions I saw earlier about had anyone applied for SBO grants. And I do know that he did, but he's not a tourist railroad. So I don't know if any tourist railroads that actually did. None have come up yet. But.
Well, huge thanks, Mark. I mean, really, it's a very optimistic summer ahead, I think, in general, and in the crystal ball as we move forward here. A final 15-second little wrap up. Thank you so much, Rob. Anything else you'd like to add from the southern state of Texas? Oh, I think you're on mute there.
Nope, I think that's it, Josh. Thank you for the opportunity to visit with you guys and share some wisdom.
Excellent. Doug, TSA.
Thank you much for having me. Encourage all the folks to get out and enjoy the tourist railroads, because it's some of the best experiences you can have. So have a good summer.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for saying that too, because it is going to be a great summer to go out and to ride a scenic heritage railroad. And thanks so much for both of you for coming and joining and representing the government side of the railroad world. And Mark, huge thanks to you as always for being here with us from HeritageRail Alliance. And I'm Josh in Duluth, Minnesota. I'm going to turn it back over to our host, Dynamic Ticket Solutions, and Mike Kuehl, awesome ticketing system that we use here at Railroad. I'm going to give you a plug. And it's a huge thanks to you for bringing all these railroads together for Tourist Railroad Connections.
Josh, Rob, Doug, Mark, thank you again very much. And Josh, as always, enjoy working with you. Thank you so, so much. We hope that you found this helpful and would like to encourage your feedback. We'll be scheduling our next webinar in the upcoming weeks so we can continue this conversation. You'll get an email invitation out the next week or so before the webinar, so please watch your email, and please feel free to share it with the invitation with people you think might be able to benefit from our conversation. Let's all stay safe and stay connected. Thank you.
Thank you.